Every human has a story, a legacy, a start, a middle, and an end. Stories can tell facts, stories can tell fiction. Some stories take twists and turns that we don't suspect. Stories don't always have a happy ending. But stories aren't bound to books, and our tales can intertwine. Your story can collide with someone else's story, shaping their future, changing their life. With your help, Penny Appeal are changing the stories of millions of people in over 30 countries around the world. Penny Appeal's story has one simple ethos: using your small change to make a big difference. What will your story be? What will our story be?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings throughout the world, throughout the universe. We pray that you all are well in these crazy times we are living in. My name is Dustin Cron. I'm the founder of the Center for Global Muslim Life. We're here in our final weekend of this film festival, weekend number 5, and we have some really amazing films like what we're talking about right now with this film Lissa, The Making of Lissa, this amazing graphic novel. Tonight we have Hamtramck USA, a film that was featured in South by Southwest about a bunch of Muslims running for office in the first Muslim majority city in the United States, in Michigan. Tomorrow we have this incredible film from Mexico called Somos Musulmanes about Muslim communities in Chiapas. And then on Sunday we have our closing night session, which is about the incredible group of short films that were sent in from around the world to the film festival, and we also selected our winners, which you can find on our website now. Today, first I wanted to start by thanking our sponsors, of course, Penny Appeal Worldwide. We wouldn't have been able to do it without them, and also our community sponsors, Amana Mutual Funds Trust and the American Muslim Community Foundation. Today, we're joined by Professor Shireen Hamdi and also our brother Francisco Dragon, who's a filmmaker. Shireen is an associate professor at UC Irvine, and she has her PhD from NYU. She studies medical anthropology, science, technology, and society, bioethics, comics, Islam, Egypt, and the Middle East. And Francisco is a multilingual, multitasking documentary filmmaker who received his certificate in digital and visual cultures from ISCTE in Lisbon, Portugal. And he's, multilingual, amazing filmmaker, and we invite them both in. Greetings, peace. How are you all?
Alaikum.
All right. How are you?
Alaikum salam.
Right.
Good. Thank you for being here with us today. Yeah, this film that we just screened, you all can find it on our YouTube channel if you haven't watched it so far. Could you all just talk about the idea? Maybe we start with you, Shireen, about why you made this film. And I think it's really fascinating as a piece of what I would call like decolonizing anthropology in the terms of like really letting the people speak, but also creating academic work that's more accessible to wider audiences by creating a graphic novel, and of course by creating a film for how you created this, showing your process.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that question, and thanks for including our film. So yeah, I worked a lot in Egypt on debates about medicine and politics, Islam, what can be done to the body, what can't. There was a big debate about organ transplantation and whether that violates God's ownership over everybody's bodies. And what I argue in my first book, Our Bodies Belong to God, is that Muslim ethics is always argued within context. And in the situation of Egypt, the first years of organ transplantation, actually everywhere where it was practiced, there was a lot of harm done to the early patients. It was a rocky beginning. It wasn't like an immediate success the way we see it now, where organ replacement can really extend and enhance people's lives. But also under an authoritarian regime where there's very little space for political expression, it became a kind of flashpoint where people started airing these wider grievances because it instantiated a case where it seemed very visibly that the poor, down to their very flesh and bones, could be exploited for the benefit of the wealthy, because a black market had emerged in which wealthy people were buying organs from poor Egyptians, also from migrants. And so this generated a lot of anxiety. So anyway, I felt like after I wrote that book, I had so much to say about how Islamic ethics works, about how it interfaces with medical information and knowledge, and also about the political nature of disease. Because a lot of what wasn't being asked in Egypt was, why are people getting sick to begin with? Why is there so much kidney disease and liver disease, leading so many people to need kidneys and livers? That was enhancing this debate. And so I felt that this academic text, like you said, was very much in the mold of anthropology discipline that rests on a long colonial history, and obviously privileges the written word, which is not accessible to everybody. And I was reading more graphic novels. I was really influenced by Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and also Marjan Satrapi, Persepolis. And I thought, what would it be like to translate my academic research findings into graphic novel form? And then coincidentally, I had seen Francesco Dragone's ethnographic film about two artists, one in Ethiopia and one in the Netherlands, who find each other and they communicate through art. And I was really moved by that film. So I thought, could we bring Francesco on board with this project and have him document what I'm doing so that it becomes legible and maybe encourages other academics and researchers to engage in more accessible forms?
And so, Francesco, talk about this. Like, what is it like? I think we've talked about this throughout the film festival, that some of the most difficult films to make are films about ideas. Mm-hmm. This really abstract philosophical thing, and then you have to take film and turn those ideas into images. So can you talk about what you thought about this project when you were brought on, and then how you kind of translated it to film?
Yeah, so thank you for this question. So the idea of developing a movie based on a dream, that's how I lived, Shireen vision at the very beginning, because when she contacted me, she really just had this beautiful idea of bringing on board two artists, young artists from RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, and kind of like bringing them on board of a journey. There was like a lot of learning curve for everyone, right? And so what really happened is that from an ethical standpoint of view, I just try to portray my subject faithfully, whatever that is, whatever the subject may be. And so in that sense, it was almost like taking on a journey altogether and transform what was just an idea into something that was a documentary. So in that sense, I love the fact that we have like a different layers, almost like a multi-vocality, multi-voices into that. And what I ended up doing, it was just like trying to bridging this very different and apart world, and kind of like portray their movement towards the center, towards this, the final project. It was actually the book all along. There was the conjunction from the very beginning. So I just tried to do my best from the very beginning in listening to the different voices coming from two very different disciplines, like anthropology, that was kind of my background, and then art or comics, which I love from a very young age, and try to faithfully portray that.
Yeah, and I think you did a great job. Shireen, let's talk a bit about this idea that it's like academic work. Part of the problem of anthropology is you're representing people, and oftentimes you're representing them in a very theoretical way. Like you said, you yourself were consuming a lot of graphic novels, but how did most professors don't think this way, like, oh, I'm going to actually turn my theory into praxis and try to get this to a wider audience. So talk about just the beginning of like, how did you bring in RISD? How did you bring in the artists that are featured in the film? And then how did you meet Francisco?
Actually, I started writing a fictional graphic novel, sort of very loosely based on my own experiences growing up Muslim and American in the U.S. And that was really kind of the beginning of my love for comics. And so I started reading them, and I found that there's a field now, an emerging field called graphic medicine, which is based on a lot of illness narratives. It's patients going through a particular medical issue, and making it really accessible, making disability something non-stigmatizing, sharing information about their journeys with the illness. And because I teach medical anthropology, I started assigning them in classes, and I realized that students responded really, really well. So, for example, there's a great one I love by David Small called Stitches. And it's the story of a young boy who develops cancer, and he literally loses his voice, and nobody tells him what's going on. And the images are about, expressing some of the things that can't be spoken or can't be written in text form. There's, so many. There's one called Tyranny, about a girl's struggle with anorexia, and she depicts her anorexia as a skeletal monster who's like choking her every time she tries to eat. And it's another really imaginative way to convey something pretty abstract, like an eating disorder. So because I saw how much the students really got into the comics, that's when I thought, okay, well, most of the ones that are available are memoirs. And as a researcher, I want to describe something that's much more social political. I want to describe also abstract ideas like the social determinants of health. Why is health a political issue? Why is the way that we distribute our resources throughout the world make some people more and some people less likely to get sick? And so that was the kind of very difficult part. And I worked with Coleman Nye, who was my co-author on this project. She started out as a PhD student of mine at Brown University. And I really have to credit her with a lot of the translation of the abstract questions into a script and dialogue. And we decided to tell it from the perspective of a story. So there are two characters that you can get emotionally invested on, and you're interested to see how they each face this life or death medical decision and how they come to see the very political nature of illness and health. And the RISD connection was just, because I was at Brown University. RISD's just there, down the hill. And I just, cold called the chair of the illustration department and told him my idea. And I really didn't know what I was getting into, but they were very generous. And they put me in touch with the comics instructor, who then selected two of his top students. And because we didn't really have a budget, we didn't have money to pay professional artists. So we got these students on board who began drawing as part of credit for their courses. And that's how this whole thing started.
Yeah, that's amazing. But then I think, as some of the students say in the film, like, oh, we think it's a dream. We didn't think we'd actually end up in Egypt. And then all of a sudden you were all in Cairo all of a sudden. And I spent time in Cairo in 2016. And to me, it was a very, very heavy space, heavy energy throughout the city. And also, I think the heaviness of seeing all these posters of the martyrs of the revolution painted on buildings throughout the city. And then especially there's like a journalist unions building where the entire front of the building at that time, I don't know if it still exists, is covered in these posters of martyrs from the revolution. And now it's amazing that we're almost 10 years after the revolution now. But talk about that, right? Egypt is known for its film industry, of course, but there's not necessarily a lot of political film that comes from Egypt. So talk about how difficult the difficulties of making the film as, Westerners coming into Egypt and then wanting to make what isn't a really political film, but talk about surveillance and censorship. There's a few moments where the screen becomes black because you have to put down the camera. I don't know which one of you wants to take the question first.
I think we can both spoke to that, but without the presence of Shireen or an Egyptian person that kind of like help you out to navigate that situation, it would have been impossible, honestly. We went there in January, so very close to the revolution anniversary, you know, and so that made it so much more intense and so much more hyper control. So to respond to your question about like where are the Egyptian movies that talk about the revolution, well, there aren't, because it's basically, you know, it's a dictatorship that is like really censoring all of those ideas. So for us, we were like on the tipping of our toes all the time, and I got stopped multiple times, and everyone was like super paranoid, not just us, but like the situation, as you could, as you mentioned before, you could really breathe, you know, something that is not quite right when you're moving around. Luckily, I didn't have a lot of gear, so I knew what I was going into to some extent. And so I tried to literally like traveling very light and not call for too much of attention. But I remember even with a small camera, you know, like a GoPro, inside a building, inside the hospital. One day I just took a few screenshots around, and immediately people in disguise, you know, not in the uniform, secret police were like just asking questions. And Shireen was really good at that kind of dodging that bullet, and we kind of move along. But over the course of that week, we experienced a lot of pressure, a couple of other times as well. And so what I really used as a strategy basically was to get all the interviews with content and with calm inside the safe place that was like the hotel rooms, and everything else was actually done with the contribution of a lot of people that kind of like donated that that found footage of the revolution, so to give a little bit back, you know, of that. And then another friend of ours, Marie Skelada, which is a student in anthropology as well, donated some of the footage just the street of Cairo, because, you know, as an Egyptian, you move around a little bit more freely with a camera. Definitely not an easy task, but altogether, I think that I kind of, we managed to give an uplifting recount of that story, even though it was it was not a happy story, both the fictional and the actual part of being there. But I hope that, you know, that came across kind of like signifying the stressful and giving back that situation without, you know, destroying completely the good sides of that.
And Shireen, can you talk about it from your perspective as an Egyptian American and kind of walking between those worlds?
Yeah, so like Fras said, obviously the counter-revolution prevailed, and Egypt is in a military dictatorship now. There's very, very heavy military and police presence all around the square, preventing anything like what instigated the 2011 uprisings from happening again. And there are tens of thousands of prisoners, political prisoners, imprisoned today. So the situation is dire, but the whole point of the project and the title, Lissa, was to give hope. Lissa, to say it's not over yet. Lissa in Egyptian colloquial Arabic means todavía no, but it also means todavía. Like, it's still the case, but also not yet. It's not over yet. Pas encore and toujours at the same time. So that Lissa, like, Lissa, there's still reason to be hopeful that the same people who imagined a better tomorrow with dignity and freedom of expression are there in Egypt, and those hopes can't be completely crushed. They can, you know, paint over the graffiti as many times as they want, but the memories reside. And so we wanted to just have a small role in documenting that and recapturing that.
Yeah, and let's talk more about that. I think the way that the revolution lives on at this point is basically through stories. So can you talk a bit about people's willingness to share their stories? Was there a lot of fear there, or, you know, what is the state of things, so to say, in terms of storytelling about the revolution?
Yeah, it's mixed. So there are definitely people who people feel very burnt out on the revolution, that they fought so hard and sacrificed so much and saw such little gain. But there's also a nostalgia for it, and I think the two coexist. And the other thing that I think we wanted to do with our project was, there was a time, especially during the revolution, when there was almost like an academic tourism industry, when there were a lot of academics, political scientists, economists who had long said, Egypt is the most authoritarian state, a revolution would never be able to happen, and then they were completely taken by surprise by the Arab Spring. And there's this whole, tendency of academics, rushing to the square, using Egyptian activists and Egyptian intellectuals and academics like their native informants, explain to me what's happening. Then they rush back to the US and they publish and they get ahead with their careers. And the Egyptian intellectuals are still left there fighting the tear gas. And we didn't want to contribute to that inequality. We wanted to make it very clear that we are indebted to the intellectual labor of the Egyptians, whether it's the graffiti artists who are, documenting the martyrs and creating this amazing art, or the Egyptian doctors who set up makeshift hospitals in the street and risk their lives to save people and to treat the wounded. And so our strategy for that was to capture those voices, not only in the film about it, but also in the graphic novel itself, and to make some of these key players characters. So they're comic characters, which gives them some kind of anonymity, but also pays tribute to what they did.
Yeah, if I may add a little bit, nowadays we can see how the revolution somehow is not over. There are still people fighting for it. In fact, the other day, Shireen shared the news that Sana Saif, which is the youngest sister of an activist, got abducted. When we were there, probably a couple of weeks after we left, Giulio Regeni disappeared. So, we were kind of like willing to raise up all those voices and try to raise a little bit of awareness of what's actually was happening, and it's still happening in Egypt, because most of the people don't know, especially because everything that kind of like swept under the rug. But we wanted to kind of raise that awareness, and luckily, we were able to capture some of those things that even if they are washed away, they will become part of the history. And definitely storytelling is all about shedding a light on certain passages of a story, especially the one that are mostly, they're very difficult to talk about, but there is a necessity, and you can tell because a lot of people were willing to share all these stories, even though they were at risk. We see the doctor, one of the doctors in the documentary that became also a character in the graphic novel. And it was very nice, that moment when he was willing to share, and you could tell that he was like kind of putting it himself out there and like his life almost on the line at risk, but he was willing to get that voice out. So Hammer Shabbat did that.
Yeah, that's the section of the film about the doctors of Tahrir, speaking, of course, of like frontliners and the doctors who are always on the front line. Wasn't there a filmmaker who was arrested recently? Can you talk about what is the state of political prisoners in Egypt and today?
Well, Sanat Saif, who Raj just mentioned, her family was protesting the conditions of the prisoners and asking for them to be released, especially in the context of the pandemic. And the reaction was to instill more fear and terror in the family for asking for better prison conditions. So not good. And the filmmaker that you mentioned died in custody a few weeks ago. So yeah, it's a dark period, but one that we still want to hold on to the hope of better days to come.
Inshallah. Yeah, but let's, one of the crazy things about this film festival for me is we had like 20 conversations with people around the world, and it's all like from my house and my garage, right? And at the same time, the films all seem like a time capsule. right now that we're all stuck here. Here you are traveling around the world like we used to, and I think it brings up a question to me about, you know, being creative in these times. How are you imagining going about your work moving forward, both of you, being that at this point it seems like we could be kind of quarantined / in our homes for the immediate long term, it seems like.
Well, I will try to take on that question. It's a very difficult one, but you know, in moments of this, you know, every time there is like a huge turn up in the history that you couldn't really prevent, like this one, you gotta be optimistic a little bit. You know, there is always like a downside and an upside. Every time there is like a huge trauma, people will need to live through it, and the survivors will always try to stay positive and being uplifting and upbringing for the newest generation. So that's my contribution. You know, I've been talking with a lot of people, honestly, that were far out of reach, and maybe we were all like super busy before. You're running around trying to, you know, make movies or write books or teaching lesson. Everyone that is involved in this kind of environment know that there is a certain degree of uncertainty that is always going to be there with you, and you're still kind of doing this job because you love it. And so honestly, I really hope that this will bring more filmmaking in the conversation and more professor, and there's going to be a lot of like cross-cultural intersectionality in a way, and all of a sudden we realize how important it is something like, you know, like Lissa, which is uncharted waters, honestly. We were moving into something that was not, you know, it's like 3 disciplines basically, you know. It's like filmmaking and graphic novel, and it's also anthropology, medical anthropology specifically, different languages. So it's really about creating a common language that could be the starting point or something new that was not there before. So that's what I really hope, that there's going to be a lot of more dialogue between different disciplines moving forward.
Shireen?
Well, you know, the good news of being stuck at home is that there are very boring, labor-intensive aspects of the kind of work we do. So sometimes, you know, you actually really need that space to focus. And this is a time that I hope people can take advantage of in writing their stories and reaching out, even if it means virtually or on the phone, and taking the time to document them, whether by writing or by comics or by drawing or even by film. And I'll also say I was very happy during I mean, not that I'm happy, of course, the COVID pandemic is terrible, but I am glad that it provoked questions about health and the role of health in politics. And the group in Egypt, the Cairo Image Collective, reached out to us, and we'll be sharing the film as a way to bring up questions about healthcare and politics and class, and who is at risk and who isn't in terms of COVID, but using Lissa as a case study. So I hope that, you know, that having health and disease on our minds also makes people think about it in different ways, like we're trying to prompt them to do with Lissa.
Yeah, it just shows how much the world is at risk based on how good your healthcare system is, basically, right? It's like this myth that the United States is the wealthiest, most, quote, developed country in the world, and then we see the absolute disaster as the epicenter of this global pandemic, and what it means to not have everyone have access to good health care. Yeah, so we want to thank you, Francisco. I want to ask Shireen a few more questions about representation of Muslims in media. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about, or upcoming projects you're working on, or?
No, as of right now, you know, I'm kind of like writing new ideas as of right now. But certainly, like, thank you for the opportunity. First of all, keep sharing the documentary, keep sharing the love, and thank you for this opportunity. It was really great.
Thank you, Fra.
Yeah, thank you for being with us. Great to see you.
Likewise, nice meeting you. Bye.
Yeah, so we started this conversation in your class about, I guess it was almost last December now, but really about representation of Muslims in media, which is a big part of your work. And it's fascinating, like looking through the global group of films we have, like this, it's not that hard, right? To do this well, because one of the things we've talked about is in the festival, there's probably there's about 4 different ways Muslims are represented. One is, of course, the Islamophobic discourses. 2 is Muslims as liberalized Westerners, basically. So it's either other or same. Right. And then the third one being kind of Muslim stories, but their Muslimness isn't at the center of the story. And then you have these films that are reflect the beauty of the people and are generally made by Muslims. Can you kind of talk about what you see in the film and television worlds of Muslim representation today?
Yeah, I think it parallels a lot of discussions about representation in general, the role of the academy. Right now, we're seeing a lot of, thank God, finally recognition that Black Lives Matter and that racism persists in our country, and a lot of questions about who is in the media, who's in the police force, who are in the institutions that are reproducing these ideas that demean Black people in the United States and globally, and of course that portray Muslims as these horrible, scary people. And we have so much to learn from our African American history on how to negotiate those stereotypes. So I think that the more voices there are, like people say, you don't need to just pass the mic. Or sorry, you don't need to represent other people or learn how to represent other people well. You just need to pass the mic, right? And so giving others the platform, giving marginalized people the platform to tell their own stories is so crucial. Having more Black voices and Black intellectuals in the space of the US Academy will do so much to change our knowledge production. And, just like having more women in the sciences, having Muslims behind the camera, it's not hard to do it well. You just have to know what you're doing, and you just have to know that Muslims, live Muslim lives, and that they're not, these objects to look at from the outside. And I remember, Dustin, when I saw your film, that there was this really beautiful aerial view of the Muslim prayers, and the Muslims are in sujood. And I remember thinking, that's a beautiful way to show Muslims in sujood, but it reminded me of all the times I see that in a very negative way, where the camera is angled in a way to demean Muslims in worship and in prostration. And it was about the intent. It was also about the positionality of the camera and what you were trying to do, and also understanding what sujood means, right? It's a way of coming closer to God, not a way of debasing yourself, which is a lot of how our Western media portrays it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we talked about is even just the positioning of the cameras, right? Like that oftentimes, even from a television news production angle, they'll put cameras behind everyone, and then it's essentially you're shooting photos of people's butts while they're praying. Whereas, of course, we as Muslims, you align the camera in a way where you're showing them directly praying, and so it has to do with how we film people. Yeah, so I don't know what are some good examples of Muslims in media that you've been watching or you've been consuming recently. Shout outs, can be political films, can be anything, spiritual films, cultural films, whatever it may be.
I like Zarina Grewal's documentary about Chris Jackson. I think it does a really good job. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, of course.
By the Dawn's Early Light. I think that does a really good job of showing Muslim, like why somebody would be drawn to Islam, Chris Jackson's conversion, and also about the tensions that exist between the African American Muslim community and the immigrant community. So I think that film is great. I've always loved this. It's an older film. It's Moroccan. It's called Bab as-Samaa Maftuh, or Door to the Sky. And that's also a very beautiful one about a Moroccan woman who's very Francophile, goes to France, forgets everything about her religion and culture, and then returns to the Maghreb because of her father's funeral, and then finds a path and finds a path to devotion. So I think those are very nice. I mean, mostly just because it only recently aired, but Rami is very much on people's radars now in discussion. I think there's so much to say about Rami Youssef's series, but basically that, you know, he's trying to make a space where Muslims can be full, you know, the full spectrum. They can be sinners and lovers and haters, and they can be problematic, and they don't have to always be in defense and opposing the dominant Islamophobic narrative, because then that puts the burden on us to always, you know, then you can only tolerate a Muslim if the Muslim is a saint. Whereas, you know, the idea is we should tolerate everybody because everybody's human. And so showing that full spectrum of Muslim life, I think it causes a lot of controversy. That might be what he's intending with the series. But I also feel like it gives a lot of breathing room for Muslims to be all kinds of different ways.
And I think it's just the nuance, even right in the second season, having Mahershala Ali play a sheikh. And there was a really beautiful article we've talked about a few times where Rami Youssef's interviewing Mahershala Ali, and he asks him, "How do you do this every time?" And he's like, "I pray before I start acting, and I ask for sincerity," right? And that even within the second season, he's taking bay'ah with a sheikh, right? This idea of the Sufi path, of the spiritual path of Islam. And I think that's one of the things we've represented in this film festival is the very diverse global voices, right? One of the first, ranging from like Yasmin Ahmed's films from Malaysia, and someone complained about those films saying, "Oh, well, the cinematography is not great." And it's like, yeah, well, she's a female filmmaker, you know, probably raising with no government funding, making the film on a very small budget, and yet those films are loved throughout Southeast Asia, right? And they're made almost 15 years ago now. To the film that we had with Tahir Qawwali, talking about Qawwali music in Pakistan, and really using his platform to feature film Qawwali singers, masters, right, in Pakistan. So I think there's so much of this. We had a couple comments from Shamim, writes, "Great discussion, awesome documentary, and fascinating ethnoGRAPHIC novel. Congratulations."
Thank you.
And she's viewing from South Africa. So this shows like the globality of it. And I think that to me is one of the most fascinating things about this idea of global Muslim film is you have, of course, I think Ava DuVernay is the trailblazer, right? Where she's really saying it's not even about ultimately making films. We see the films that are being made. It's also about distribution. Mm-hmm. It's also about the business side of it. It's about people seeing the films. So that's one of the difficulties we still have in the space is there's so many of these films even within this festival that didn't have distribution, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing it. This is such important work.
Yeah, no, thank you. So yeah, thank you again for everyone. The film will be up for the next 24 hours on our YouTube page for everyone who wants to watch Lissa. And thank you, Shireen. We still have Francisco. Thank you, Francisco. So yeah, so thank you all so much. And with that, anything else you want to say?
No, I love this idea. Keep it up. Keep us in the loop. Keep the creative Muslim voices circulating. It's really, really wonderful. Jazakallah for doing it all.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Like I said, we have another screening tonight at 7 with this film, Hamtramck USA. Super fascinating. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Okay.